From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, August 30th. On September 1, just days after we are recording this, Oregon's legal landscape is going to undergo what feels like a fairly massive change. After a little more than 3 years of the state experimenting with drug decriminalization, it will once again be a crime to possess small amounts of drugs in every corner of Oregon. But this is not a straight-up return to the old drug war days, at least not in the minds of the politicians who passed this new law. Instead, most Oregon counties will be launching a new experiment, one that in theory will route drug users toward treatment rather than jail. Today, we are going to try to break down what this new system might look like in practice and why some of our neighbors to the north in Washington think Oregon is making some crucial mistakes. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
I'm OPB Justice and Legal Affairs reporter Conrad Wilson.
I'm OPB's Public Safety and Health editor Michelle Wiley.
Conrad, great to have you. Michelle, especially great to have you. It's your first time on OPB Politics Now. You just both completed what I think was a pretty Herculean task, which was sifting through hundreds of pages of documents, trying to figure out exactly how recriminalization might look in different counties and different portions of the state, and then synthesizing that for folks who are interested. Before we get into all that nitty-gritty, I think we should talk a little bit, though, about how we got here. Conrad, take us back to 2020.
Sure. So, it's 2020, during the thick of the pandemic, drug legalization proponents put forward ballot measure 110, and it both decriminalized small amounts of drug possession, and it also dedicated funding to expanding drug treatment services. The hope with all of that is that Oregon would be a leader in sort of casting aside, criminal consequences for drug addiction and really move, towards like what folks in public health circles thought was maybe a more enlightened model. The idea being by pushing aside police and prosecutors and really, trying to cement drug addiction as something that's dealt with in the healthcare system in Oregon rather than, the criminal justice system.
Yeah, Oregon was going to be the first state in the nation to fully ditch the drug war. We had realized it didn't work. It had all these bad impacts. It didn't quite work out in the very hopeful way that people maybe expected in 2020 for a bunch of reasons.
The rollout was botched, and in part because no one in the state government really took responsibility over implementing 110. And really to the extent that kind of the primary agency that would do that, the Oregon Health Authority, that they were able to, they're also dealing with, the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're just totally swamped. So it took years before funds really started to flow to service providers. A key part of the way Measure 110 was implemented also had some problems. It put police in the position of handing out citations to people using drugs in public. And the idea was that after getting a ticket, people would they were supposed to call a state hotline to access treatment. But pretty quickly, it became clear no one called. Part of that was that police in some counties just appeared really reluctant to kind of do that and really engage in handing out tickets. But also giving someone on the street in the throes of a drug addiction, a piece of paper and hope that they call this hotline to get help. It was one of those ideas that was cooked up in a conference room, and it didn't really translate into reality. So not only were law enforcement unable to connect people to treatment using tickets, but fentanyl began flooding the streets. As a result, people pretty quickly became disenchanted with the law.
Fentanyl's flooding the streets, overdoses are increasing. And just to put a finer point on this ticket, we gave people a $100 ticket and said, look, we'll drop the $100 ticket if you call this hotline. But if you just ignore the ticket, nothing's going to happen. We're not going to make sure you pay it. So absolutely no consequences. It didn't work very well. And that brings us to earlier this year when, lawmakers came to the Capitol for legislative session. They had a lot of pressure, I think, to act. There was this well-funded, by most accounts, probably pretty popular ballot measure that was making its way through the system that would have rolled back most of Measure 110, certainly recriminalized drugs, and I think instituted some criminal consequences that a lot of people that really liked a lot of the policy believed were far too severe, including a lot of Democratic lawmakers. And so, Democrats who control the legislature arrived ready to sort of make a deal, and they did pass their own approach to recriminalization. what does it look like? Walk us through it.
Yeah, I mean, they passed a law, as you said, that recriminalized drug possession and making it a misdemeanor crime that could be penalized by up to 180 days in jail. But really, lawmakers tried to kind of frame the legislation, and you saw this, more than anybody, as something that was meant to sort of offer treatment while adding accountability. That word accountability is just like, it came up all the time. And lawmakers talked about how the bill had these sort of off-ramps, it was a kind of another buzzword from the session, aimed at sort of engaging the criminal justice system to sort of nudge people into treatment, but then also offered ways for people, to get their charges dismissed after folks completed treatment. But it also set up a totally new programs aimed at keeping people outside the criminal justice system entirely through a process called deflection.
Yes, deflection. The reason we are here today. I mean, this is the word that is spoken a lot. You hear it a lot in media. I think one thing the three of us have talked about is that even though we hear the word deflection now, it doesn't always seem like everyone is operating with the same understanding of what it means. Some people will argue a program is deflection, while other people say that doesn't count. It's kind of a hot potato in some ways, but in broad strokes, when we say deflection in this room, I guess, what are we thinking of?
Yeah, so the new law defines deflection as partnerships between law enforcement, behavioral health providers, people who do drug treatment, outreach, et cetera. And the aim of those partnerships is to deflect people away from the criminal justice system and into treatment. So these deflection programs are being set up in most of Oregon's counties, 28 out of 36, with funding from the state.
But, as you said, Dirk, counties are not necessarily in lockstep about what deflection is or how they should approach it. And that really is a consequence of how the legislature wrote the bill, leaving it up to the counties to decide not only what it looks like, but whether they want to participate in deflection at all.
Yeah, and that really brings us to what I most want to talk about, which is this very interesting story. You both recently wrote this kind of 10,000-foot view, looking at how different counties around the state are approaching deflection, how it might differ from one place to another. I mean, it's this hugely complicated question about what deflection will mean in coming days and months. But I think we should just start with some of the top line conclusions. You guys looked at how every county that's doing deflection is proposing to do so, and you came away with some, I think, fairly high-level conclusions. So walk us through what you found.
Yeah, so of the counties participating, which, 28, like I said, half say they'll be up and running on the 1st. That's according to the applications we looked at. Others could be up in October. Some won't be running until January.
Well, and, because eligibility criteria really ranges from county to county, many of these programs will likely be pretty small, really limited, at least initially.
And the other thing, too, is, all of this is aimed at getting people into treatment, but the state is still facing capacity challenges. And, there may be some treatment available. It might not be exactly what a person needs.
I mean, this notion of these vastly different systems in different counties, I think, is just so important for people to understand here, not just because of the different experiences people will have depending on which county line they are sitting on which side of, but because it's maybe going to make a difference in how successful a county is at meeting this goal of getting drug users hooked up with services rather than routing them through the criminal justice system. So what are some of the biggest differences or the really big differences we're seeing county to county in how they approach this question?
Yeah, there are many. So, one of the big ones is eligibility. In many counties, you can only get into a deflection program if you're charged with just drug possession, no other crime. In other counties, the programs are broader. Like if you're in possession and also commit a low-level crime, like let's say trespassing or something, you could also be eligible to enter deflection. There's also who's running the programs. They're by design big collaborations between different agencies, public health, district attorneys, county officials. We see some pretty big differences in who's in charge.
Well, and then there's the programs themselves. I mean, many are using an officer intervention model where the police officer makes first contact and then is like the referral point for getting services.
Yeah, and others have these mobile outreach programs where peer support, behavioral health workers like go out into the field and meet people. Some counties are building whole deflection centers, like physical buildings that people can be dropped off at by police. So big differences.
Yeah, huge differences. And I want to try to make it a little bit more real for people let's just do this thought experiment where I'm a person caught with drugs in a specific county. Like, how might that look? So let's start with Oregon City in Clackamas County. I am arrested by police or encountered by police. I have drugs on me. What might I expect?
Okay. So Clackamas is using the officer intervention model. So how that would look, based on what we've heard from Clackamas County and seen in their application, is if you're found in possession, officer will give you a citation to community court. That citation and the police report that they write up after they interact with you will go to the DA's office, along with past criminal history, any other kind of information they have, where they'll evaluate if you're eligible for the deflection program. If you are, a program navigator will try and reach out to you ahead of the court appearance. If they can't get a hold of you, they'll meet you at court to offer you deflection. And if the offer is accepted, we should say these are voluntary programs, so you can say no. But if you accept it, then that's where the connection to treatment will occur.
And really, only people facing the crime of drug possession are eligible for deflection in Clackamas County. So that doesn't include trespassing or anything else associated with maybe public drug use. And so the fact that they're referring to a court, even though it's like a community court where there are these services meant to help people, it has been controversial and really almost meant they didn't get their funding because some believe that it was just too closely linked to the criminal justice system, which deflection is supposed to avoid.
Yeah, it's what we were talking about. I mean, people are arguing that's not deflection because you're sending someone to court. You're not sending them away from the criminal justice system, but actually into its beating heart. How can that work? But Clackamas County did get its money and it's proceeding with that path.
Well, and it's really clear that, their program does meet the definition of the law. I mean, the district attorney, John Wentworth, read the definition from the statute during this meeting where he's trying to get funding and basically said, this is my program. This is what the statute says. I'm following the law, and it was, they got the money. It was hard to refute that.
Okay. I have drugs on me, but I'm in Eugene. I'm in Lane County. The police come across me. What can I expect?
Yeah, so Lane County is one of those counties that doesn't have its program up and running yet. That's supposed to happen in October, according to the application. So if this happens in October, when it launches, the county is taking a pretty comprehensive approach. First, it's using that broader eligibility criteria we talked about. So low-level crimes would be considered as well as possession. They're using the officer intervention method, much like Clackamas County, as well as mobile crisis outreach. So what that looks like is a police officer will determine if someone is eligible, and then, they'll call a program navigator to the scene to get you evaluated and hopefully into a treatment program.
We should talk a little, just to touch on these navigators, like if you talk to folks in a lot of other jurisdictions that do this, it is often a very immediate response. So it's not like, I have heard some concerns that police could be waiting for a very long time, but I think some folks that do this in other parts of the country, you will see navigators there in 15 minutes or at least within a half hour. There's a premium on someone is maybe in crisis, maybe has an addiction, and we are going to rush out there and try to get them help. And I just want to be clear on that because I think that's what a lot of people see as a very innovative part of this model.
Well, and one thing that Michelle and I heard over and over in talking to these counties this summer is, yes, they want to get to that point, but they're rushing to hire staff. They're trying to contract with service providers and nonprofits so they can get to that point. And, there's questions about even if they'll be able to get to that point,
Yeah. Okay, now I'm in Portland. I'm actually in Portland, but I've got drugs on me. A lot has been made about open drug use in Portland. So what is the system that Multnomah County has conceived?
Yeah, this one is complicated. So, I'll say what's slated to happen September 1st. Starting out, the county is doing mobile outreach. It's kind of similar to what Lane County is doing. They're also trying to stand up this deflection center, the physical building in inner southeast Portland, where at some point, mid to late October, according to the county, law enforcement can drop people off to get deflected, engage in services. But getting that facility up has been a real challenge, from getting getting the building itself in good shape to get people in, staffing concerns, and getting some real pushback from neighbors. And in the county, there also seems to be a lot of, for lack of a better word, politics at play to some extent. You know, County Chair Jessica Vega Peterson has been taking point to this to some extent, which has caused some frustration among the other commissioners. Here's Commissioner Sharon Myron at a recent meeting.
A building was leased by the chair without notifying the board, and at a cost of $2 million that will be needed for refurbishment. While this building will be demolished in a couple of years, this thing happened to be right by a preschool. And still, neither the board nor neighbors were engaged meaningfully in the process.
So that's been a big frustration. And then, you know, I listened to a recent meeting at Portland City Council where a lot of other concerns came up when they were talking about deflection. And it seemed at a certain point that, you know, the city council didn't actually really have a good grasp of what the program is or even how deflection is supposed to work. So still a lot of things to overcome before this is implemented.
Right. And we are also hearing that, you know, until the deflection center gets up and running, the county is going to have these peer navigators coming out, but only between I think 8 a.m. to 8 p.m.
Yeah.
So if you're arrested outside of that, or if you encounter a police officer outside of that, maybe you're going to jail, whereas in 2 hours you would have been routed to services. And so, you know, this is very, very complex stuff. I hope that's coming across to listeners and a very rushed timeline, but it is also kind of chaotic in a lot of places.
Well, and legal concerns too. I mean, there have been just questions about if you're getting different services at different times of the day, you know, is that legal?
Right.
And also just like, and I, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've seen, it's like, it's changed a lot. Like just over the last few weeks, like what exactly the county is doing, how it's going to work. A lot of these questions are still open and we're days away from this starting. So I think it's almost a little difficult to say what the rollout will look like until September 1st hits.
As you said, Michelle, deflection is being pursued in 28 of the state's 36 counties. That leaves us with 8 who are not interested in any of this for whatever reason. What do we know about them?
I mean, we don't know a lot. We do know that there are, as you said, 8 of them. Some of them just didn't get very much money. Others, you know, have kind of a reason. We spoke with Douglas County Sheriff John Hanlon, and here's what he said.
I was happy that we reversed it. I just didn't feel that we reversed it far enough.
So he's saying good riddance to Measure 110, but I really wanted all of Measure 110 gone, maybe not part of it, and because of that, I'm not interested in. Basically, I'm not interested in routing people toward services and not arresting them. We should just go back to recriminalization. That's what I hear, at least. I want to hijack this just a little bit because you guys have been diving deep into this, and I did too. This notion of very different experiences in very different counties. And I actually wound up recently taking a look at the state of Washington, which I was pretty surprised when I looked into it to realize had a very, very similar experience to what we are now doing in Oregon. So back in 2021, the state of Washington's Supreme Court ruled that drug possession laws there were unconstitutional. A technical reason they were saying, you know, you could be caught with drugs without knowing you had drugs on you. And because of that, there's a constitutional issue. So this law is unconstitutional. Basically, overnight, Washington state suddenly had no law against drug possession. And that obviously put a lot of pressure on lawmakers who were in session to pass a new bill. What was fascinating to me is that they tried almost exactly what Oregon is doing now. They wanted to put forth a policy where they reintroduced criminal penalties for drug possession, but they wanted to also attempt to get drug users steered to treatment and not toward the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and they have a pretty uniform approach to this, right?
Exactly. Yeah, their approach was very different in some ways from Oregon, and we should go over that a little bit. I mean, the first big difference is they required every county to participate in their version of deflection. They said, we're going to fund this statewide, counties get in line, this is what we're doing. The second big one is that they didn't want to give counties this ability to choose their own adventure, sort of like we are doing in Oregon. Instead, their whole idea was to export this model that had been used successfully in Seattle for the last decade, ever since 2011. This is a system called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, or LEAD. And at its most basic level, it's a lot of what we've been talking about. It's a way to bring social service providers and police together to sort of strategize how to achieve the best outcomes for people with some very severe issues. Often that includes addiction, but it's also often associated with homelessness, sometimes prostitution in some places. Study after study has shown that this leads to better outcomes for people. And as a result, it's been very successful. It's expanded throughout the country and I think to other countries. So, this experiment of Washington trying this around the state has been going on for 3 years. And some of the people I talked to there are very closely watching Oregon. And they think we're about to see some chaos. They think, all these different versions of deflection are maybe going to be a bad thing. Here is Washington Representative Lauren Davis, who was a key author of that state's program.
You shouldn't reinvent the wheel. You should use an evidence-based program. I mean, there's a ton of evidence for LEAD. I didn't just take it out of thin air, right? It's an evidence-based model that's been replicated internationally. And that would be, that would just be absurd. Why are you gonna, take a stick and scratch in the dirt and try to come up with some new fangled program?
Not pulling many punches is Representative Lauren Davis. Conrad, this is something that sort of emerged, I think in a lot of your reporting, right? Particularly when it comes to whether a county wanted to limit what crimes were eligible for a person to be ready for deflection. There was this question of how much these systems might be used.
Right. One thing we've heard from law enforcement and really observed during ride-alongs we've done with police is that, it's pretty rare to catch someone on possession alone. It definitely happens. There have been, thousands of ballot measure 110 tickets cut statewide during the last several years during decriminalization. But typically, officers are encountering people for other reasons, and the limitations on who can enter a deflection program in the counties that have deflection programs and counties that are going to have deflection programs ready starting September 1st, it's going to be pretty small.
Yeah, and the last estimate we got from Multnomah County was, that they would have somewhere between 30 to 40 people get into their program each month.
This is actually something that emerged when I spoke with people in Washington State too. I talked with Lisa Dugard. She's a Seattle attorney. She's a key architect of that LEAD model that they're using up in Seattle and around the country. And she was pretty blatantly critical, actually, of this idea that counties will be disqualifying people who might have minor charges alongside drug possession. She said that wasn't going to be effective. Here's a little bit of how she put it.
It is practically useless to set up a whole elaborate system that's only for people who the only crime they commit is drug possession. The people who are really causing public impact are committing crimes beyond drug possession. You may have a snapshot in time of right now it's drug possession, but 3 hours later it's trespass, 3 hours later it's, theft, 3 hours later it's harassment because they're out of their minds and they're saying really crazy things to people.
So, that is the view of one person who I think is an acknowledged expert in this field, has more than a decade of experience trying to do this kind of work. And obviously, it's not a particularly sunny viewpoint. One thing you both noted in your story is that the lawmakers who designed the system in Oregon are expecting that it's going to go through a lot of changes. That is kind of how they felt like it was designed.
Yeah, so Bend Representative Jason Krupp, he's a Democrat, a former prosecutor, one of the sponsors of the bill that recriminalized drug possession in Oregon. He spoke in early August before the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission. That's the state agency that's sort of helping set up deflection around the state.
We knew these programs would look different, and I think we actually encouraged that. We knew that programs in Clackamas County or Clatsop County or Columbia County would look different. We wanted people struggling with addiction to be able to make a quicker connection to those services and have the opportunity to avoid formal prosecution if they were caught in possession of drugs. We viewed this as a period of innovation and experimentation.
And Kropp said lawmakers would take the data that they're getting and really work towards improving deflection programs going forward. So, there's an expectation, I guess, both from lawmakers and county officials that there are going to be some changes in the months and years to come.
Yeah, I mean, that's just very important to keep in mind. Almost regardless of what happens on Sunday or the months after, we expect Oregon's system is going to grow and change and hopefully, over time find better and better ways to help people who have drug addiction and are experiencing all these other issues. But there's this other pretty major thing that we haven't talked a lot about. I know Michelle mentioned it briefly, which is that even if Oregon has the most efficient, sort of compassionate way to steer people to services, Oregon doesn't have a lot of services to steer them to.
Yeah, and I think that's the piece that makes things really challenging, There was a study in February of this year from the State Health Authority that said Oregon needs to add 3,000 behavioral health beds to meet its needs, which will likely take years. Then there's staffing needs. We're seeing challenges hiring enough behavioral health staff locally and nationally. And, we spoke to county leadership and they said they're seeing these issues too. Nick O'Cone is the division manager with Washington County Behavioral Health, and he really illustrated this point.
Currently in Washington County, there are no sobering resources. There is very limited residential treatment. There's no publicly funded withdrawal management. And we're working on bringing our Center for Addictions Triage and Treatment to Washington County in 2025. We're really excited about that. And even with this incredible development to our system of care, we know it's not going to fulfill the entire capacity.
And one of the things he said was that, they have services, but those services might be between 9 and 5, Monday through Friday, which, as we know, does not meet the needs of everyone who's seeking treatment.
And so the question is, what does this mean, right? In this larger deflection ecosystem, are we just going to see police taking people to jail because there are not the services to route them to, or how does it all interact?
Yeah, I think it's tough to say at this point. There's been a lot of focus from lawmakers, county officials. They're trying to craft these programs in ways that ensure the process is easy for law enforcement, that it doesn't add additional hurdles. And the other thing to say is deflection is just one part of this, right? The new law has other options people can pursue. If deflection is rejected, you could try conditional discharge, where criminal charges are dismissed if treatment is completed. Prosecutors can pursue probation or even jail time as a last resort. So there are some other options.
And the other thing I think we should note is that, even though we are going back to drug criminalization, that piece of Measure 110 is done. There's another piece of Measure 110, as Conrad said, that is still alive. And that piece is routing cannabis tax money to counties and service providers around the state with the hope of really bolstering, ramping up, improving this system of services, treatment, all sorts of other things that Oregon can expect. And that is still very much ongoing. So, even though the services are threadbare in some ways right now, there is real hope that that is going to change.
And we shouldn't discount the work that people are doing. We see often people working to stand up these treatment centers, working to add more providers. So this work is happening. It's just a challenge of speed and timing, but, hopefully everything will meet together.
There is also kind of a grounding, a sobering reality here, too. I mean, I spoke with Christopher Campbell. He's a professor at Portland State University, and he's studied Measure 110. And the conversation we had, I felt really summed up this idea of how things might work once drugs are recriminalized. Campbell said, based on research, there's really no data to suggest that recriminalizing drugs will connect more people to treatment. And he also kind of talked about how this might give officers a tool that they haven't had for the last several years at least.
The officers, it definitely gives them one more tool in their tool belt. That they didn't have previously. They felt like it was stripped from them, was this ability to engage with them on a more substantive level. For them to be able to come across somebody and say, you either get to go to this deflection program or you're going to jail tonight, is meaningful. I think it's going to be meaningful for a lot of people who are having substance use disorder because they don't want to detox. I mean, that's a scary thing. It's a terrible thing. So I think that's going to be something that the police try to leverage a lot.
Basically, we shouldn't expect by recriminalizing drugs to get more people into treatment. based on historical data.
Correct.
Okay.
So we have no evidence to suggest that the criminal justice system is going to improve connections to treatment.
That's Portland State University's Christopher Campbell making that assessment really based on research he's done.
Well, on that very hopeful note, this has been a lot. I think we're going to leave it here today. I know you both will be following along on this sort of bold new adventure we have here in Oregon. I expect we'll be talking a lot about how all this is working in the near future. Thanks so much for coming in today, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This episode of OPB Politics Now was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Nalene Silva, and our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, as always, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. While you're there, become a member, and you can rate and review us in your podcast app of choice, or find Politics Now on YouTube. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.